is one that gives us hope. As parents, we all wonder if we can be doing more for our kids. First, by staying on top of the science and research about ADHD, but also by making lifestyle changes to help optimize our kids' brains, minimize symptoms, so they can live a happier, more productive life. As it turns out, we can play a role in that. ADHD genes are not destiny. A child's genetic predisposition to ADHD, or anything else for that matter, can be changed by the environment, by the child's early and subsequent experiences. And that's great news for all of us. We have with us today Joel Nigg, author of the recently released book, Getting Ahead of ADHD, What Next Generation Science Says About Treatments That Work, and How You Can Make Them Work for Your Child. He is a clinical psychologist and professor in the departments of psychiatry and behavioral neuroscience at Oregon Health and Science University. His exploration and research in the area of genes and environment makes him the perfect person to talk about their effects in ADHD. A little housekeeping first. Joel will give you a presentation about the topic, and then he will take your questions. If you're new to our webinars, post your questions in the box on the right of your screen. That being said, I'll turn it over to Joel. Joel, it's great to have you here today, and thanks a lot. It's an exciting topic for all of us.
Thanks, Wayne, and hi, everybody. Without further ado, we'll move into this. I'm going to just start just a quick minute on a catch-up because this webinar is really a follow-up to a webinar I did a month ago with Attitude on the new science of ADHD and the new framework for why we're putting more onto the environment than we were in the past. I'm going to hit a couple of headlines from that, a new understanding, before I dive into the content here. The first big headline was that ADHD is being rethought of now, not so much just as a disorder of attention or even executive functioning, but one of a disorder of self-regulation that involves emotion as well as impulsivity and attention. That means that when you have difficulties like your child being angry or overly reactive or overly anxious, that can be part of the ADHD syndrome. It sometimes is a separate disorder, of course, but it sometimes is part of the ADHD syndrome. And so some of the things we're going to talk about today as far as lifestyle changes may benefit ADHD not just by improving attention, but also by improving emotional regulation and irritability and some of those secondary, so-called secondary symptoms that sometimes can feel primary. The second piece here is that science has really moved past the outmoded idea that genes are destiny or that it's all genetic. We know there's a major genetic influence in ADHD, there's no question, and my lab is among the labs that are putting a lot of effort into finding genes and gene networks that are involved. However, what we're seeing now is that the genes are really setting the stage or setting the propensity for ADHD, but the early and subsequent environment is activating and modulating this, sometimes dramatically, so that what we're seeing is that it is always genes plus environment, and we're moving that now away from the black box. That was always, of course, an easy platitude, genes plus environment, but now it's away from the black box and getting a specific genes, specific environments, and how they work. And that's where the science is going, and what the book does is really point the future that we think we're going to see and try to capitalize on that future now by harnessing some things that we can sort of see are going to come to fruition as they're starting to now. Really, there's this next slide is simply that illustration that ADHD is emotion, cognition, and action. Adding emotion to this circle is really, I think, become accepted now in the research community, and it's just starting to percolate down into clinical practice. This next slide is really an illustration just that epigenetic changes are really changes to the biology of the DNA, that they don't change the DNA sequence, but so we're not doing gene editing here. They change how the gene is expressed. The analogy I use is turning the radio dial up on your radio. You haven't changed the station, but the volume is different on that station, and you can change the volume of different genes, and that has an effect on behavior and mood. And as the slide shows, there's any number of experiential factors that will affect this in various degrees. There's two other major changes in the science just in the last 3 or 4 years. The first is this big change in epigenetics of behavior. That's a big development the last 3 or 4 years. The second big change the last 3 or 4 years is better brain imaging, so we have much more detailed brain understanding. And the third is a real arrival of the science of statistical meta-analysis. So we now can pool all the data from hundreds of studies and thousands of participants to get much more precise estimates of what works and what doesn't work for ADHD. So that's what we harness in the book, and I'll touch on some of that in the talk. All right, without further ado, let's move into sleep. And I'm going to probably spend more time on sleep than on exercise or diet because it's so important and so neglected in ADHD. There's two parts to sleep. One is it can be a problem area, but it's also a great opportunity to help kids learn and grow. Let's start with the part many of you are probably familiar with, and that is that most of you and most of your kids don't get enough sleep. I'm probably in that group too. I'll talk a minute about how much sleep your children should be getting. There's a lot of controversy about whether ADHD involves primary sleep disorders like sleep apnea and restless leg syndrome and that sort of thing. It turns out that it's probably not that big of an overlap. There surely is some slight elevation there in which kids which are misdiagnosed with ADHD that really have a primary sleep disorder. But most of the genuine ADHD cases do not have a primary sleep disorder, with a possible exception of what's called sleep-wake phase disorder. And that's a disorder I'll talk about in a second. On the other hand, secondary sleep problems, behaviorally related sleep problems, child is not ready to go to bed, doesn't want to go to bed, fights bedtime, there's a number of those kind of behavior problems that are extremely common. Probably majority of kids with ADHD have difficulties in these secondary behavioral disruptions of sleep that in turn interferes with their attention and their executive functioning and so on. So it's a kind of negative cycle there, but it's driven by the behavior, not by an endogenous or biological sleep disorder. Start with how much sleep kids should be getting. Some of you may have seen this before. I've talked to many parents and even physicians who are not aware of these numbers. But if you look at this and think about your daily schedule, you want your school-age child to get 10 hours of sleep. If you're going to do a 30 to 45-minute bedtime routine, which I'm going to recommend, that means 11 hours out of your child's day is devoted to bedtime and sleep. So if you're going to go to school at 8 o'clock and get up at 7, you can do the math on this. It's a pretty short evening, and this is difficult for all of us with homework and activities in the evening and so on, but nonetheless, this is the target. Another big challenge for teens, and we'll talk about, is that they naturally want to sleep late in the morning, and our modern school schedules don't work well with that, so we have a few systemic challenges for all of us as well. So I'm going to circle back to the sleep problems and the sleep-wake phase disorder in a minute, but I want to move quickly to the benefits of sleep and the reasons why sleep can be such a powerful tool for ADHD if we can get the sleep going well. The first big myth about sleep is that it's not very important, and it's part of why a lot of us probably don't sleep enough. We think it's not a productive period of time. But the reality is just the opposite. Sleep, in fact, is when we learn. It's when we remember. It's when kids do the best learning is when they're sleeping. They consolidate what they got exposed to that day in school or at home and organize it in their brain while they sleep. We all do that, but it's especially striking in children because there's so much learning that they're doing. Here's a quick crash course on how learning works, and this includes learning and memory for children and adults, really. But the first is that when we're awake, we encode, and you can see the little cartoon down below there of the neurons kind of recording this information. During sleep, the brain literally replays those neural activations, and we can see that now with modern brain imaging, and consolidates that learning so that the next day that information is retrieved more efficiently, as shown in the final panel here. And we see this in the brain imaging, and I'm not going to go through this row by row, but this just is a illustration that what it does unpack is that the brain plays the same circuit activations in sleep that it played during the day on a given task learning. And so this is some evidence that the brain is actually rehearsing and consolidating what it saw that day during sleep, and that's part of how learning happens. It's discarding unimportant information, creating those neural networks and semantic networks. And we have data, that I didn't show here, but showing that in fact kids who are exposed to new learning and then take a nap and then get up and take a test actually do better on that test than kids who are exposed to new learning and do something else. There's even some evidence now that an hour of sleep may be more productive than an hour of further study for some kinds of learning. So just underscoring that sleep is not a luxury but a vital part of the learning process for everyone, and we now know this is true even for very young children. I want to say a word about screens, and we could do a whole webinar on screens and ADHD, of course, but the important part related to sleep is that blue screens do confuse the body's daily sleep-wake clock. We have a clock in the brain called the suprachiasmatic nucleus that cycles our body through our sleep-wake cycle. It's light entrained when you're a baby, and it's light cued when you're an adult. And so this is involved in our hormone cycles, melatonin, cortisol. All the hormones respond to the cycling from this circadian clock that depends on light. Blue screens confuse it. Bright light confuses it, and it's difficult to go to sleep if you've been looking at your cell phone or your computer all evening because your body doesn't make the right hormones for sleep because the clock has been confused and blinded, if you will, by that light. So the science of this now has become quite clear, and so the action item here is to get those screens away from the face an hour before sleep time. And in a pinch, there is some research on orange screen light, and of course many of you probably have found the apps that'll turn your phone to orange light in the evening and so on. But the best of all is to have your child away from the screen for that last hour before sleep. All right, so here's the action steps for sleep that I go over in detail in the sleep chapter of the book and set a lot of context for it. First of all, the behavioral part of sleep is probably going to be the biggest challenge for most of us with kids with ADHD. And there's a number of good tips on this at the sleep websites that are in the book, and on my website. The National Sleep Foundation is the primary one. But a couple of keys here, we put more keys in the book, and if all else fails, the 45-minute routine is important. If all else fails, you can develop a behavior program with a behavioral therapist. There are well-established, effective programs for doing this. They take some time, but they do work. And there's a number of techniques. There's really 4 basic approaches. They all work about the same effectiveness. So there's a lot of flexibility there. But the overall key is, and I think what a lot of parents end up struggling with is having the time to put in this routine and in a nice, relaxed, positive routine behaviorally towards sleep. And then a couple of tips here if you're interested in maximizing learning and attention. Some of the new studies that are interesting, they show that the key consolidation of learning during sleep is really about 2 to 3 hours after the learning occurs. And so this is one tip that I give to college kids, but it would help all of us really, including our children, is a quick review of the key lessons from the day 2 or 3 hours before you go to sleep, even if it's just a 10-minute review of that math concept or that idea. That enhances learning a little bit. This is certainly a big plug for preschoolers who are still napping, to let them do that. They're probably benefiting from that. And then an interesting twist, this has still got to be verified, but a couple of studies are suggesting that a cue during sleep that doesn't wake you up about the learning actually enhances learning. And so a pleasant smell during studies and the same smell in the bedroom. This is a little bit of a, it could be a little burdensome, but I thought it was an interesting point to notice that probably the new science is going to develop even better ways to harness sleep-based learning. All right, I want to move on to exercise here. Exercise and sleep, of course, go together. We'll talk about that. But let me make a couple of points about that here. First, exercise also helps children learn. This is just a slide from Hillman at Illinois, who's done a lot of research on this. And they've done randomized experiments, they and other groups as well, in which children are assigned to exercise or not exercise after school. And then they look at their learning and test taking in subsequent weeks. They do this for multiple weeks at a time. This brain image simply shows that an average of 20 children taking a test, those that have exercised and those that haven't. And the red is the area of the most brain activation. And what the slide is showing us is that the children that exercised have a lot more brain activation and brain activity during the test taking, implying that their brain would be more efficient and more engaged and more alert and basically more attentive. And in fact, that's what bears out in the testing that these kids did. Their math and their reading was better and more accurate for those that exercised versus those that didn't. And that was randomly assigned. So the only explanation is the exercise. This is another important finding that from a variety of groups, that on executive functioning tests, this is just a flanker task, but you can see the dramatic difference in the left and right of the screen. The children that have had the exercise fitness program are much more alert and attentive during this difficult executive functioning or attention task, and in fact their performance, I do not show the performance data, but the performance was better as well. So there's clear evidence now that across the board that exercise really develops children's learning and executive functioning, both in the brain and in their performance. This is just another slide showing that exercise actually grows the brain physically. We get richer and denser brain volumes. Here the left-hand cartoon shows in the humans where the hippocampus is, which is critical to learning, and a variety of other attention functions. The right hand is just the graph of the animal slide. And here's a cartoon of this just showing how neural connections grow. This particular author likes to use the analogy of connection between cities, but these really would be brain regions. So you might have prefrontal cortex on the right and hippocampus on the left, and these brain networks have a certain efficiency and density to them. And then fitness programs grow the density of these neural networks with the result that the brain is more efficient, and this is what explains the better executive functioning and better learning in kids that are fit and that are on a regular fitness program or that exercise regularly. And this has been shown now not only in correlational studies but in experimental studies where random assignment exercise programs are not. And just as a slight editorial here, this is a strong argument for maintaining recess in schools. Schools that are cutting recess are probably, kids actually do better learning after recess than they do after more study hall. So, but this is one of the reasons is that exercise is so powerful in growing the brain, especially during development, and in particular in the areas of the brain that are exactly those areas that are important for ADHD in terms of learning and executive functioning. All right, so here's what we know now, just again from meta-analytic studies and experimental studies just in the last 2 or 3 years, and we can sort of anticipate where this is going to go for the field going forward. First of all, we know that acute exercise, that means exercise right before school, right before class, improves attention and learning that same day. Even 20 minutes of exercise causes kids to pay attention better in school and learn better. So it's a powerful tool in the short run. We also know that sustained exercise, weeks of good fitness activity, it can reverse the epigenetic changes that emerge from stress and trauma. So we could do a whole webinar on the role of stress and trauma in ADHD. It's another important overlooked area that we put considerable effort into in the book. But one reason that stress disturbs development is it changes gene expression permanently by making epigenetic marks on the genome. Exercise can reverse those marks and literally erase the biological effect of the traumatic or stressful experience. This has been demonstrated in animals, and there's no reason to think it wouldn't work in humans as well. There's more details to that, but that's a side benefit for the emotional piece, since kids with ADHD, I believe, and I think there's considerable evidence to support this, are more sensitive to and more responsive to stressful and traumatic events than kids without ADHD. So they show a more enduring negative effect to harmful emotional experiences. Exercise helps buffer that. Thirdly, we know that sustained fitness improves brain growth, brain connections, brain efficiency, even after a few weeks of consistent exercise on the order of a half an hour to an hour a day. An hour a day is recommended. We'll see better brain growth, better oxygenation of the brain, better neural connections, richer dendritic connections, and so on. There's a variety of brain changes. And crucially, these effects are most clear in the brain areas relevant to ADHD, executive functioning, attention, and learning. A lot of this research has been on normal children, and so what we're just seeing now, there's been about a dozen studies, randomized trials with kids who actually have ADHD to see how much their symptoms will improve with exercise, just to know how big are the effects, how big are the benefits. Most of those individual studies have serious problems in their methodology, so it's difficult to draw really strong conclusions, but we have had a couple of, I think we've had 3 meta-analytic studies just in the last 12 months come out in the literature on exercise and ADHD, and the consensus seems to be emerging that while the literature is still small, this effect is moderate. It's a bigger effect. Exercise alone has a bigger effect than diet changes alone, for example. Not as big of an effect as medication or some of the more powerful, but for something that has no downside, exercise appears to be showing a noticeable, visible in real life effect on ADHD symptoms in these clinical trials. So we're going to stay tuned for more definitive effect size estimates, but I think the jury is in that exercise is one of the top priorities for our lifestyle program for kids with ADHD. So what's the action plan then for exercise? The big challenge here for most families is time. A lot of kids with ADHD don't want to exercise, they don't feel like doing anything active, they want to stay in the house or something like that. So how do we move forward on that? But let me lay out the key action steps here. First of all, be hopeful. The biological roots here can be affected, and exercise is one way to do that. An hour a day is ideal of exercise, but it doesn't have to be all at once. 15-minute blocks of activity are just as good as 1 hour of activity. The exercise should be moderate or vigorous. That means the child should be breathing hard. They don't have to be exhausted, but running, playing tag, rollerblading, games that involve a lot of large motor movement and running around or climbing around outside or inside are ideal. Varied activities that involve muscle learning and coordination are even better. There's still debate in the literature about whether aerobic exercise or complex motor exercise like martial arts and basketball and dance are more beneficial than simple aerobics like running or bicycling. That's still a debate in the literature, jury's still out. But varying the activity is one plus. As I say, at the practical level, for many families, when are we going to do this? This is hard to do. Child doesn't want to do it. Finding something fun, doing something together. In the book, we listed a number of examples and ideas of what people have tried successfully. But I encourage you to experiment here. If your child is not interested in one approach, try another one. Look for something you can do together. It's a fun activity in some instances for those of you that are able to exercise yourself. At the very least, though, encourage the outdoor play and the active play for young kids. and this will be helpful. It doesn't have to be a sport. It can be a solo activity or even a play activity. Except if you can't do it all, this is not something we want you to feel guilty about not doing enough. Even a little is better than nothing, and so doing what you can, accepting that you can do that right now, that's okay. All right, let me say a few things about diet, and again, we could do a whole webinar on this, but I want to hit a few highlights. We touched on this last week. We talked about the strong evidence that diet has major epigenetic effects in growth. Here's a few key findings here. The first of all, the brain is mostly fat, and the fatty cells around the neurons are what make brain signaling efficient. And this is one reason why we think that the best evidence we have on diet involves long-chain fatty acids, omega-3 fatty acids. They clearly are beneficial for ADHD. That's a finding that's just become clear and established in the last 3 years and increasingly clear every year. This is fatty fish or fish oil does help ADHD. Again, the effect is not, I'm not saying this is going to cure it for every child, but it does have a benefit. It's part of the set of programs you can put in place. Secondly, we know that brain signaling requires a lot of micronutrients, and so if these are deficient, that's going to affect kids with ADHD. We are still having a lot of debate about the micronutrients, but the way this literature is headed, I think we're going to be at a point in 3 or 4 years where we have concluded that micronutrients are beneficial if they're enhanced. Certainly if a child has a shortage of these, it's going to affect their attention. The critical piece here is that while the average population effects are modest for diet, they are real, and for some individuals they are large. And I think this is going to be an area of new focus the next couple of years. Here's the action plan that highlights that I suggest. First of all, some dietary changes are simple and some are hard. So evaluate what you can do initially and then maybe add some steps later. Some of the things that don't take extra time are the shopping, getting more fresh and less processed foods. This helps get rid of some of the additives. It also brings more nutritious food in. Adding oily fish, if your child doesn't want to eat the fish, you can use fish oil supplements. Eliminating caffeine in sports drinks. We do a whole lot of work on caffeine in the book, but as kids are drinking a surprising amount of caffeine, and that's a whole talk almost, but take away the sports drinks and try to eliminate the caffeine for children. There's controversy about whether caffeine can help ADHD, but the risks with children are too great to justify it in children. Maybe in adults, we can talk about that. The next 4 steps here are things that take a little more effort. They won't be possible for all of you to do, but for those that want to do them, they're worth trying. Blood levels, it may be low. Here's a vitamin D, iron, omega-3s are the most common. There's allergenic foods, eggs, nuts that we talk about. Some kids seem to be reactive to these with ADHD, and that if they are eliminated, that can help, and it does help in some cases. The sugar, I'm not so convinced in the literature that sugar is making the child hyperactive right now, but sugar has so many negative health effects that on the child's brain growth long term. I think the long-term effects of sugar intake are probably more important than the acute effects. And so getting rid of boxed and canned foods will eliminate most of the additive sugar. Again, not everybody can do this, but a little bit is better than nothing if you can do some of it. And then the myth, one of the myths is that children will only eat a certain food. The research seems to show that if you go through the proper behavioral changes, and you have to do this gradually and a little bit of behavioral sensitivity, but once you transition over to nothing but healthy food choices, your child will choose one and eat it. Part of the challenge we have is we're giving children both healthy and unhealthy food choices, and they are choosing the unhealthy option. So the trick here is that there's a little bit of behavioral sensitivity needed to transition those food choices so that it's not overwhelming adjustment for the child all at once, but that it's gradual exposure, gradually moving this in so it doesn't become a emotionally loaded issue around the food. We want it to be low key. So we could talk a little bit about the behavioral elements of this, but with the right behavioral guidance and sensitivity, we can usually move children away from their attachment to unhealthy foods toward only having healthy food choices and choosing one or more of those healthy foods and maintaining their own health that way. There are very ambitious total overhaul diets where you eliminate all food additives, eliminate all allergenic foods, go with a few foods diet. These more ambitious and costly efforts can be beneficial. However, they can be risky as well. If you eliminate too many foods, you can eliminate critical nutrients. And so if you're going to do a few foods diet or an oligogenic diet, I strongly recommend a dietitian be involved to make sure you maintain appropriate nutrient levels. All right, let me wrap this up with some synergy here. Sleep, food, and exercise obviously have interactions with each other. Children who exercise are hungrier. Children who eat well feel better during exercise and can exercise better. Sleep makes exercise more fulfilling, and exercise makes you want to sleep better. So there are positive synergies here that we're shooting for. Each of these things will modify gene expression, modify brain growth, and modify the biology and help the ADHD-prone child to do better. There's a decision tree involved. Doing all of these things is too hard for many parents because there's just too much time involved and too many pieces. So I recommend, and we created a flow chart, a decision tree that you can use to decide what is going to work for you. The first issue has to do with how urgent is your situation. That'll affect what you do first, whether you move directly into medical help before you try lifestyle changes or vice versa. The second is determining what is the main focus, emotion versus attention, and so on. And then what are you capable of doing right now? What do you want to postpone until later? You don't have to do everything at once. And then you sequence and blend your standard treatments and your complementary and lifestyle treatments, building up little by little with the pieces that you can do. The result is that there will be an individualized sequence for each family. Some families will start with self-help, maybe starting with diet or maybe starting with exercise, depending on what is easiest and most reachable for you. And then when that has reached its maximum benefit and is not quite enough, you may go for professional help to balance it out, reevaluate and modify. For others, the situation may be more urgent. You may start with professional help and then amplify it, and then perhaps be able to back off of some of the medical interventions once you've got the self-help and lifestyle pieces in place. I think most families with ADHD, I recommend a blend, an integrated approach that's individualized to your abilities and needs. So in conclusion, it makes sense to balance the best of professional care with the new emerging effective lifestyle, quote-unquote alternative steps. I do not recommend these as replacing regular established treatments, but rather complementing them. And I think what we're going to see is that you will need a lower dose of medication or a less intensive counseling when these lifestyle pieces have been established and are beginning to get traction for your child. It will be different for different families. Certainly in my experience, what each family can do is different. Resources are different. That's okay. That's why we have these different options. The more of them you do, you may get synergy, but one or two of them alone may have benefit and certainly has had benefit in many cases. Often what will happen is you'll try a behavior plan, you'll try to change diet or change sleep, and you run into behavioral struggles with your child. It's quite straightforward for many professional counselors to help you work out the behavior plan to address sleep or diet. So if you set up your lifestyle plan and it's not working, get a pro to consult with you and troubleshoot that plan. And again, we've got more details available. So I want to thank you all for attending. I hope this is helpful, and I think we have the rest of the time available for discussion.
Yeah, that was great, Joel. Really, very enlightening. Loads of questions about melatonin and sleep. Some parents have taken it upon themselves to try the melatonin. Others have worked with doctors. Where does it fit into helping a child with ADHD sleep, melatonin?
That's a great question. In fact, I had a couple slides of melatonin in one version of this talk, and we have devoted pages to it in this book. A few comments on melatonin. First of all, melatonin is a hormone. it has important interactions with other hormones. So first recommendation is don't use it without talking to your doctor. Especially for infants and very little kids, it can affect the entraining of the circadian system that's supposed to happen by the light cycle. And with teens, where there's so much hormonal involvement in development, the interaction with other hormones is not well understood. So yes, melatonin can be helpful, but please involve your physician in using it so that you are thinking about these potential medical effects. Related to that, there are a number of side effects that melatonin can bring that you have to be aware of. Thirdly, most over-the-counter melatonins are too high of a dose. Often the child will do better with a smaller dose of melatonin than the dose in the bottle. So buy a pill cutter and cut these pills down. A milligram.
Would you have any specific recommendation to start with there, or it depends on the child?
A milligram is often plenty.
Oh, okay.
And many of these bottles have 2 or 3 milligrams. For many kids, a half a milligram will be enough. So it doesn't take very much. A common mistake with melatonin is waiting too long to give it. It's supposed to be given several hours before sleep time, so those hormone levels can gradually rise and adapt. So don't think of it as a sleeping pill. Don't give it right before sleep. Give it at dinner time, so several hours. And the right time to give it is actually different for each child. So if you're really having trouble with this sleep cycle, you can work with a sleep specialist, and they can advise you on exactly when to give that melatonin for your child, just depending on their circadian cycle. Melatonin is most important for kids who have the sleep-wake phase syndrome, where they aren't tired at night and can't wake up in the morning. And melatonin can help reset that sleep-wake clock if given in the right dose at the right time of day. However, because melatonin is a powerful hormone with potential side effects, it's the recommendation that we've made in consultation with sleep experts when I wrote the book was to try behavioral solutions first and use melatonin as a backup. And I realize, again, for many parents, a big behavior plan is beyond the reach because there's just too much pressure on the family and school is starting, and so then they may have to go to melatonin. But do involve your clinician and do pay attention to that dose.
Very quickly, because I know there are a lot of questions. You mentioned side effects of melatonin. Someone just asked that question as you were saying it. I was wondering if you could just very quickly, what would be some of the side effects?
Well, yeah, I can pull them up here. Headaches, night sweats. Let's see if I can find them here. Give me 30 seconds and I'll pull them up. Let's see. Yeah. You can wake up in the middle of the night and not go back to sleep. It does not help sustain sleep. It only helps begin sleep. So if the problem is waking up in the middle of the night, melatonin may make the problem worse. The biggest concern is the morning hangover, being drowsy and headachy the next morning, feeling kind of down the next morning, and daytime tiredness. So that's something. Bedwetting is also one. So that's often due to giving it too late in the day or giving too high of a dose.
Do you have a general, turning to fish oil, do you have a general dosage that might be good depending on the age of the child? Several people have asked that.
1,000 milligrams is a good target, and an EPA DHA mix is good. There's controversy over which particular omega-3s are most important, so I think the mix is good. It looks like from the literature that 1,000 milligrams is a good target. You're safe up to probably 2,000 or 3,000 milligrams, but you're going to start to get issues like bloating and diarrhea if you go too high. So based on the literature at this point, there's not a lot of good dosage studies, but I would aim for 1,000 milligrams. By the way, you'll get that easily if you eat a quarter, 6 or 7 ounces of fish.
Right. Yeah, one of the problem parents have is getting the kids to take it because it's sort of, a lot of kids don't eat fish and some of the formulations taste very fishy.
Exactly.
I'm just asking, do you have any recommendations to make the fish oil go down a little more easily?
Yeah, I mean, it is a trial and error issue. I mean, there are fish oils that don't have the taste. working with the food and trying to get the fish, salmon, get them to eat the fish over time is really the ideal. But I agree with you, and I agree with the parents that are pointing this out. It's a challenge, and it's in the category of do it if you can. Now, there are other sources of omega-3. Nuts are a good one, and seeds that just aren't as, eggs can be a good one. They just aren't as dense as the fish oil. So if the fish isn't working or fish oil isn't working, look to other foods that have omega-3s in them, and you can get quite a bit that way.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to know where the science stands, well, a lot of parents do, about the role of artificial dyes and preservatives, et cetera, in terms of exacerbating ADHD symptoms. I think you addressed this in your book, but
yeah,
they want to know about that.
Yeah, that's. I think that controversy has come down in favor of, yes, there is an effect of food additives on ADHD. The literature has been confused on that by a number of methodological problems, and the biggest being very small and very old studies that we're aggregating. So the modern studies with kids today really haven't been done, so we're relying a little bit on old studies, but those data do show an effect when they're aggregated. The European Union has now required that these food colorings not be put in food anymore, the synthetic ones. The FDA in the United States has not gone that far, but the bottom line is, yes, I think they do have an effect. The effect is small. Most of the dietary effects in ADHD are probably not from food dyes, but from other additives or the combination of additives. But it looks like the preservatives, the flavorings, and the dyes in some unknown combination. So I think it really is worth it if parents can do it, to move away from the processed food. I know it sounds a little bit new agey, but it seems to be true. It won't cure ADHD for most kids, but it will have a benefit, and for a few, it will have a big effect who are very hypersensitive to these food additives.
One mom asks about they live in a city, they don't have any green areas near them. Does indoor exercise have the same positive effect as outdoor exercise?
Absolutely. The only reason I mentioned the outdoor was it's so much easier to get the large motor activity, but absolutely, indoor exercise, basketball, tennis, rock climbing, martial arts, running on a track, anything is all, dance, those are all fantastic. So there's nothing wrong with indoor exercise if outdoor is hard to do.
You mentioned that 45-minute bedtime routine. Several parents wanted some details about that. Could you very quickly go through that, just some of the high points of what happens during that bedtime routine?
Sure, yeah. So part of the idea here is to make bedtime unpressured and unhurried and relaxed and kind of mellow. But that's the time during which the child is going to brush their teeth, change their clothes, put away their things. You're going to hopefully, if you manage to have a song or a bedtime story, some kind of ritual that really makes it kind of pleasant and structured and predictable for them and gradual, and so that they have time to do their little dink around thing but still kind of keep moving forward. Once they're in bed and you have that final very positive ending with, I love the idea of a bedtime story or song as a tradition that gets established and is enjoyable and warm and intimate for the child and the parent to really have a nice warm ending of the day. And then that child gets relaxed and starts to get sleepy. They're getting pretty drowsy, and you say goodnight and leave the bedroom. They haven't quite fallen asleep yet. You don't want them to feel like they have to need you in the room in order to fall asleep, but drowsy enough that you can see they're on their way. And then there may be a little bit of a time allowed there for them to struggle with, wait, mom, call you back in the room. And that's what a lot of kids have difficulty with, is they want to call the parent back in the room over and over again and extend it. And so the parent has a struggle behaviorally managing that. But you can allow a little time for that to be learned, that once they're in the room, that they're time to go to sleep. You're not going to keep coming back in. But it'll take a little time to get to that point if they're used to that. So that it doesn't have to be 45 entire minutes, but you want to allow that amount of time so you're not pressuring the child, rushing them, and it's a relaxed, gentle process that they can unwind into the bed.
You briefly mentioned sleep programs, and you said they were pretty effective, working with a professional for a little more detailed behavioral plan. Are these things, where do you find these things? Are they expensive or?
Most of the research seems to suggest no, it shouldn't be super expensive because it's really a behavioral medicine problem from the point of view of the therapist, and so a behavioral psychologist or behavioral medicine therapist will be able to get you into a program that probably won't take more than a few sessions, a few weeks. There's some literature suggesting even one session to help you understand how to do the plan in some detail can have a benefit. So I would say that for many families with kind of what we call garden variety sleep-related behavior problems, that anywhere from 3 to 8 weeks of counseling and practice at home should be enough to get most kids into that more constructive bedtime routine. And so we're not talking years of therapy here.
Mm-hmm. And what about medication disturbing a person's sleep cycle, child sleep? ADHD meds is what I'm talking about. Some experts say to take a stimulant before bed to help calm down my son's racing mind. Others recommend that you don't.
Yes,
what does the research sort of say about that?
That's exactly right. That's been a big debate over the years. And first of all, on the average, when you just look at the aggregate of all the data, yes, the stimulant medications do have some negative effect on sleep. They can make it harder to go to sleep or make you wake up during the night. And so that does have to be thought about when treating with stimulants. Occasionally a child will benefit. Typically that problem can be avoided by modifying the timing or the method of that stimulant delivery. One of the great developments on the pharmacology front in the last few years, as Wayne, as you know, and as many of the listeners know, is we now have many, many different ways to deliver stimulant medication to children. There's all these different long-acting meds, but they all release on a different cycle. So you can, for example, have the release happen more in the first half of the day and taper out quicker, or you can have it happen more in the later half of the day. So changing that formulation so that the dosage timing that's actually being released into the body during the day can often solve any negative effects from stimulants on sleep. The idea of taking a stimulant dose in the evening, it does work for some children, probably kids who are fast metabolizers, because it'll help them to overcome the behavioral related bedtime problems. And that's why that sometimes happens. What we've seen clinically, anecdotally, is that the stimulant dose is too high, and now they're taking a sleep pill on top of the stimulant, and it's maybe often an option to try a little lower dose. And so one question is, was the dosing done starting at a low dose and working?
Mm-hmm. Hello?
Oh, sorry, Wayne. Hello, can you hear me? I think
yeah,
I
sure,
muted.
good.
I accidentally muted.
That's okay.
Anyway,
That's all right.
Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah. Just to clarify a point, someone asked official, you said 1,000 milligrams a day, right? You're saying
Yes.
per day?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. All right. Are there any especially ADHD-friendly exercises, or is it a matter of just getting in, 30, 45 minutes to an hour of some kind of aerobic, moderate breathing activity?
Yeah, I think anything that's moderate vigorous is likely to be beneficial. There, we don't have enough data to say a particular exercise is better than another one. I have some hunch based on the preliminary studies that are coming out now that exercises that combine motor learning with aerobics, such as dance, martial arts, and so on, will be perhaps the most effective for that brain growth and executive functioning for ADHD. But right now, based on the mainstream literature, anything that gets that heart rate and breathing up for an hour a day in chunks of at least 15 minutes is going to have the effect, and we don't yet. And so, which means the good news is you have a lot of flexibility in finding an activity that will work for your child. But the specificity of what exact kind of exercise is most effective, we don't have those studies done yet.
Yeah. High protein diets, I know that's something that is often mentioned in relation to ADHD. And has the science come down on they're beneficial? And if so, about how much protein should a child get a day?
We don't have the science to make a recommendation on that. I suspect that people are seeing anecdotal benefits, perhaps due to the change in diet bringing better nutrition to the child and probably less added sugar if you're taking away carbs. But overall, no, I don't think we're in a position to recommend a certain amount of protein for ADHD beyond standard health recommendations.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Those studies are just too few and too anecdotal.
Mm-hmm. A mom asks, my teen just doesn't want to go to bed until midnight. Is there some kind of genetic thing going on here that's preventing her from wanting to hit the sack? What measures can a parent take to get a teen to go to bed? Nothing seems to work. That's a tough one.
It's a very important issue for two reasons. One is that evolution has built teenagers to want to go to bed late, and our society wants them to get up early in the morning to go to school. So our social structure with schools and parent work schedules really works against evolution in terms of our teenagers. So your teenager's already at a disadvantage being born in the 21st century instead of in the 10,000 or 20,000 years ago when they could go to bed late. But the second piece is that the possibility of a sleep-wake phase disorder in which a child just is not tired in the evening and is not wakeful in the morning has to be considered. It's difficult to diagnose in teenagers because of what I just said about evolution, but I would, before you get too much deep into this, I would consult a sleep doctor to try to evaluate whether your teen has a sleep-wake phase disorder. And if they do, then a medically supervised melatonin treatment might be appropriate. Otherwise you're into behavioral steps, but I would work with a counselor on this so that you can really differentiate the biology that your teen is working against from behavioral elements here.
Is a real quick question. Someone wanted to know, when you were talking about blue light, is TV, does that emit blue light?
Yes, all the electronic screens, computers, TVs, video games, and phones all have the same problem. So I recommend none of these screens should be on in front of your face for an hour before bedtime. Now, if you've got a nice bedtime routine, that becomes kind of automatic. But yeah, all of it's the same.
And you talked about those orange light apps. Do you have any names for those? I know you said it's better to just turn off screens completely, but one parent wanted to know.
Yeah, there are. I hate to plug a particular app, but I know that all the systems, the iPhone and the Android phones, they all have functions either built in or apps you can get that will do a nighttime light. And I know Windows computers have the same thing where you can download apps. I'm reluctant to plug a particular one right out of the gate because I haven't really done a fair comparison of them. But I think they all do about the same thing. And if you just search for a nighttime or nightlight version of your screen, it'll do that. You'll see it dim and change. You can also purchase literally filters to put over a computer screen to filter the light out, the blue light. So I think these things are pretty findable though by a search.
Is there an ideal time to exercise? Is it better to do it in the morning? I mean, if possible.
Yeah, ideally the morning is the ideal for kids, because then they're ready for the school day. They're not only have they burned off their energy of wanting to be active, but they're alert and ready to learn. So the morning is ideal, but of course with today's schedules for kids and parents, that's not always possible, but that's what I would shoot for. And I certainly, if you can get that hour or a chunk of it before school, that's optimal. Otherwise, what you want to do is get it in the afternoon. You have to avoid it. The hour or two before bed, or even 3 hours before bed, exercise in the evening makes it hard to go to sleep because you're revved up. So on average, again, there may be exceptions, individuals who have the opposite experience, but on average, that's the story. So earlier in the day is better. Try to avoid it being in the evening.
In terms of those blood levels of some of the nutrients you talked about, Person asks, will a pediatrician test for levels of iron, vitamin D, magnesium, zinc, and omega-3? Is this a simple blood test?
It's not a hard blood test, but it's not routine. The standard of care does not call for these tests. So this is sort of a vision where I think we're reaching a point where it's starting to make sense to do it, but it hasn't yet reached a standard of care. So, but the pediatrician could do it, and it's a matter of talking to them and running the test. Now, some of these you can tell, the physician can tell by their exam that there's symptoms of being low on something, but my recommendation is to ask your pediatrician to go ahead and check these levels, because it's, for the most part, they're not going to get triggered automatically.
Mm-hmm.
You don't want to, and you don't want to over supplement these minerals because they can be dangerous if you take too much. So it's good to know the level before you start giving high doses of any of these.
Yeah, that's a good point. One last question about a lot of, you talk about exercises being key, but a lot of children, especially with ADHD, are punished. Recess or playground time or leisure time is taken away from them where they would normally run about. I mean, how do you see this as a problem in our school system?
Absolutely. It's a big, it bothers me a lot. I strongly oppose punishing a child by taking away physical play. Recess should be unconditional for all kids, and certainly kids with ADHD. If they need to be punished for misbehavior, there should be a different way to do it.
And this blue light question, more question. What about LED lights that you put in your lamps? Is that blue light?
It's a good question. I don't know.
Okay.
I'll try to find that out. But because I've been trying to learn more about routine house lights and what their effect is, and that's not as, I haven't seen the studies on that. It's all about computer screens, you know. So I have the same question. I just don't know. Yeah.
And team sports, finally, and a lot of parents, I wouldn't say push, but encourage their kids to get involved in team sports. We know that a lot of children with ADHD don't like that. They would prefer sports where they do their own thing. Can team sports, I mean, I guess it depends on it. Suppose, are there better team sports for kids than others in terms of the aerobic capacity? Is that something that parents should think about?
Yeah, I want to underscore that first point, that the team sport, a lot of kids with ADHD, because of their social issues with social skills or coordination, it's a negative experience to do a team sport or to do any sport, and so it's not necessary to do a team sport or even do a sport, period. It's just necessary to be active and exercising. So the solitary sports are great. In fact, one good thing about solitary sports is they become lifelong habits, whereas team sports are much harder to do when you're an adult, and so the lifelong habit's harder to form. So, and then within the team sport, what I want to pay attention to is that child really going to be active that whole time, or is there a lot of standing around? For example, I'm not a big fan of playing center field as an ADHD treatment because there's just a lot of standing around. And what I like sports like soccer or basketball where you're running the whole time, or tennis where you're doing a lot of running, or rollerblading or running or dancing or martial arts where there's constant activity. So the thing I'd really look for in terms of sports is there really sustained activity, or is there a lot of standing around?
Okay. Well, that'll have to be the last question. I think we're coming to the end. And that was just terrific. I mean, I loved it. I thought you did a great job, Joel. So I'm sure most would agree. They learned a lot today.
Well,
so thank you again.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. Thanks, everyone, and best of luck.
And for everyone else, we're grateful to you for listening to our webinar series. Don't miss our next webinar on September 26th, How to Energize Your Child's Education with Project-Based Learning. It promises to be a good one for both parents and teachers. So see you then, and have a good day, everybody.